Berlin, early 1945. The war was still being fought on paper, but not on the ground. Inside the Führer bunker, maps still covered the walls. Red and blue pins still marked divisions that no longer existed. Couriers still ran through narrow concrete corridors, carrying reports written in careful language. But beneath all of it, one truth had already settled into the room, quietly, heavily, and without announcement. Germany could not win this war. Adolf Hitler did not say it out loud. He did not need to. The signs were everywhere. By January 1945, the Eastern Front was collapsing at a speed no one in Berlin had predicted. Soviet armies were no longer advancing, they were flooding forward. Entire German units vanished from maps within days. Cities that had been declared fortresses fell without proper resistance. Reports from the front became shorter, less detailed, and increasingly vague. Hitler read them all. For years, he had survived disasters by refusing to acknowledge them. Stalingrad had been explained away as betrayal. Normandy had been blamed on weather and traitors. Every defeat had been temporary, at least in his mind. But now something was different. The reports arriving in the bunker no longer argued. They no longer offered optimism. They simply stated facts. Distances lost, divisions destroyed, fuel unavailable, reserves non-existent. Hitler began spending more time alone. Witnesses later recalled long silences during conferences, moments where Hitler stared at the map without speaking, his finger hovering over regions that had once been under German control. When generals spoke, he interrupted less often. When they finished, he did not argue, not because he agreed, but because there was nothing left to say. This silence frightened his staff more than his rage ever had. On the Western Front, the situation was no better. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last major gamble, had failed. What was meant to split the Allies had instead burned through Germany's final reserves of fuel, armor, and trained manpower. Hitler knew what that meant. There would be no second attempt. By late January, Allied forces were crossing into Germany itself. The homeland, once protected by distance and propaganda, was now the battlefield. Cities burned nightly under bombing raids. Rail lines no longer functioned. Communications broke down faster than they could be repaired. Orders issued from Berlin arrived too late or not at all. Hitler still issued commands, but fewer people were listening. Inside the Führer bunker, conferences continued as ritual. Generals stood around the map table while Hitler described counterattacks that existed only in theory. He spoke of divisions that could be reassembled, of units that would hold at all costs. But his voice lacked conviction. Those present noticed it immediately. In earlier years, Hitler had shouted, he had ranted, he had accused his generals of cowardice and betrayal. Now, when told a position could not be held, he often responded with a quiet nod. The war had moved beyond anger. In February 1945, Soviet forces crossed the Oder River, the last natural barrier before Berlin. This was the moment many officers later identified as the point of no return. Hitler studied the map that night longer than usual. The Oder was not just a river, it was a line that separated fantasy from reality. Once crossed, there would be no space left to maneuver, no territory left to trade for time. Berlin was exposed. Still, Hitler refused to leave. Several advisors suggested relocation to the south, to areas still under German control. Hitler dismissed them without discussion. Berlin, he said, was where the war would be decided. What he did not say was that Berlin was also where it would end. By early March, the Führer bunker atmosphere had changed completely. Staff officers moved quietly, avoiding unnecessary conversations. Supplies were rationed, electricity flickered. Even loyal aides sensed that the structure above them, the Reich itself, was collapsing. Hitler's health deteriorated visibly. His hands trembled, his posture stiffened. Long walks through the bunker replaced public appearances. He avoided newsreels, avoided speeches, avoided the world beyond concrete walls. Yet he listened carefully to reports from the East. Every Soviet advance brought the same conclusion closer. Berlin would fall. On March 15th, a situation report confirmed that German forces lacked the manpower to mount any coordinated defense of the capital. The numbers were not hidden, they were not exaggerated, they were simply insufficient. Hitler did not argue. Instead, he asked one question, quietly. How long? No one answered directly, because everyone in the room already knew. The next 48 hours would not decide the war. They would only confirm what had already become inevitable. The next morning, inside the bunker, did not begin with shouting or panic. It began with routine. Orders were typed, couriers waited, conferences were scheduled. On the surface, the machinery of command still functioned, but beneath it, belief had disappeared. By mid-March 1945, Hitler's conferences had changed in an important way. Generals no longer argued strategy. They argued time. How many days could a position hold? How long a road might remain open? How many hours before fuel ran out? Victory was no longer discussed. At one meeting, a senior officer carefully explained that reinforcements promised from the north did not exist. The divisions listed on the map had been destroyed weeks earlier. Hitler listened without interruption. Then he moved a marker on the map anyway. No one objected. This was the moment many later described as the true collapse, not when Berlin was surrounded, but when reality stopped correcting illusion. Outside the bunker, the Red Army was advancing with methodical precision. They no longer rushed. They no longer needed to. German resistance had become fragmented, isolated, and desperate. Entire units fought without coordination. Some held positions out of duty, others simply waited for the end. Inside Berlin, preparations were made that no one spoke about openly. Barricades were constructed using rubble and streetcars. Anti-tank weapons were distributed to boys and old men. Posters called for resistance to the last breath. Hitler approved all of it. Not because he believed it would succeed, but because he believed it was necessary. In private conversations, his language had shifted. He spoke less of Germany's future and more of fate, less of strategy and more of will. He began framing defeat not as a military failure, but as a moral judgment. If Germany could not survive, he reasoned, it did not deserve to. This idea would soon shape his final decisions. By late March, reports from the Western Front confirmed what many already suspected. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine in strength. There would be no Western miracle, no sudden collapse of the enemy, no negotiated peace. Germany was now fighting on borrowed time. Hitler still refused evacuation plans. When informed that Berlin might be encircled within weeks, he replied that a leader should not abandon his capital. The symbolism mattered more than survival. Some generals tried one last time. They suggested breaking out to the south, linking remaining forces, and continuing resistance elsewhere. Hitler rejected the idea immediately. Berlin was the Reich. Leaving it would mean admitting defeat. And that was something he would not do, at least not publicly. Privately, however, witnesses noticed something new: resignation. Hitler no longer asked for alternatives. He no longer demanded solutions. When told that an order could not be carried out, he often responded with silence. At one conference, after a particularly bleak report, he dismissed everyone early. This had never happened before. The bunker itself became quieter. Even loyal aides began speaking in lowered voices. Conversations ended when Hitler entered a room, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. No one knew what could still be said. Above ground, Berliners felt the change too. Air raids intensified, food shortages worsened, rumors spread faster than official announcements. People spoke openly about the end, something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The regime's voice was losing its authority. By early April, Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, not constantly, but enough to remind everyone in Berlin that the front was close, very close. Hitler remained underground. He spent hours reviewing maps that shrank daily. Areas once marked as German territory were crossed out, erased, or simply left blank. The war was compressing inward toward the bunker itself. On April 12th, news arrived that briefly disrupted the mood. Franklin Roosevelt was dead. For a moment, hope flickered. Hitler believed history might repeat itself, that the death of an enemy leader could change everything. He spoke of political fractures, of negotiations, of fate intervening at the last moment. But the reports from the front did not change. The Soviets continued advancing. The Allies continued closing in. Reality returned quickly. 2 days later, Soviet forces broke through key defensive lines east of Berlin. The city was now effectively encircled. Escape routes narrowed. Supply lines vanished. The war had reached its final stage. Hitler ordered preparations for a last stand, not because he believed it could succeed, but because surrender was unthinkable. Inside the bunker, final arrangements began quietly. Rooms were reassigned, security tightened, documents were reviewed, personal effects were organized. Still, no one said the word end. It was not necessary. Everyone felt it. The next 48 hours would bring the war to Berlin's streets and to the bunker itself. And Adolf Hitler knew it. The bunker was no longer just a command center. It had become a world sealed off from time. By mid-April 1945, days blended together underground. There were no mornings or nights in the usual sense, only scheduled briefings, muted footsteps, and the constant vibration of distant artillery rolling through concrete walls. Hitler's physical condition worsened noticeably. His left hand shook uncontrollably. His posture bent forward. He walked with short, dragging steps. Those closest to him later said he appeared decades older than his age. But the physical decline mattered less than the mental shift that had taken hold. He was no longer trying to win the war. He was trying to control how it ended. Orders continued to be issued, but their nature had changed. They were less about maneuver and more about symbolism. Cities were declared fortresses even when they had no defenses. Units that no longer existed were commanded to attack. Counteroffensives were planned on paper, not because they were possible, but because acknowledging impossibility meant accepting finality. And that Hitler still resisted. Inside meetings, his tone fluctuated unpredictably. At times he spoke calmly, almost detached, discussing the destruction of entire armies as if reviewing historical events rather than current reality. At other moments, sudden bursts of anger erupted, directed not at enemies, but at his own generals. He accused them of betrayal, of cowardice, of lacking faith. Few responded. They had stopped trying to convince him. One by one, senior officers requested permission to leave Berlin. Some were granted it, others were denied. Those who remained understood the unspoken truth. They were staying for the final chapter, whether they wanted to or not. Eva Braun's presence became more visible. She had lived in the shadows of power for years, but now she moved openly through the bunker. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, arranging small dinners, playing music, speaking about life after the war as if it were still imaginable. But even she understood. There would be no after. Outside, the Soviet advance was relentless. Entire neighborhoods on Berlin's outskirts fell in hours. Artillery fire became constant. The sound no longer faded between barrages. It was a continuous roar, pressing closer every day. Refugees flooded the city center. Civilians hid in basements and subway tunnels. The idea of organized defense collapsed under sheer numbers and exhaustion. Hitler was informed of each loss. Sometimes he reacted, sometimes he did not. What disturbed witnesses most was not his anger, but his indifference. At one briefing, when told that a key sector had fallen and thousands of soldiers were cut off, he simply nodded and moved on to the next report, as if that chapter were already closed. The illusion of rescue finally died when the last hopes for a southern breakout failed. The armies meant to relieve Berlin were either destroyed or immobilized. There would be no relief force, no miracle counterattack. The circle had closed. That night, Hitler spoke privately with several aides. For the first time, he openly acknowledged that the war was lost. Not in a speech, not in an announcement, but quietly, as a fact that no longer needed argument. Yet even then, surrender was never mentioned. He spoke instead about legacy, about how history would judge him, about how future generations would understand what had happened. He blamed the German people for weakness, for failing to live up to his vision. At the same time, he claimed absolute responsibility for the path taken. The contradiction went unchallenged. Plans were made for the final political acts of the regime. Drafts of a testament were discussed. Names were written, crossed out, rewritten. Loyalty was assessed not by competence, but by proximity. Who had stayed until the end? Meanwhile, above ground, Berlin was dying. Streets were choked with debris. Fires burned uncontrollably. Communication lines failed. Units fought independently, often unaware of the larger situation. Boys armed with anti-tank weapons faced experienced Soviet troops and died within minutes. The gap between the bunker and reality widened into something almost surreal. Inside, there was electricity, food, structure. Outside, there was collapse. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the last official ceremony took place. A small group gathered. Decorations were awarded to child soldiers. The moment was brief, awkward, and deeply unsettling. This was no longer a celebration. It was a farewell, disguised as tradition. Later that day, Hitler went above ground for the last time. He stood in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery Garden as shells exploded nearby. Witnesses said he looked small, fragile, and distant, a man already retreating inward. When he returned to the bunker, he would never leave it again. That night, Soviet artillery began hitting the city center directly. The sound was deafening. Dust fell from ceilings, lights flickered. The bunker shook repeatedly, reminding everyone inside that concrete had limits. Time was running out. Hitler gathered his inner circle. What he would decide next would not change the war, but it would define its ending. And the world was about to witness how far a collapsing ideology would go when faced with undeniable defeat. The decisions that followed were not sudden. They had been forming quietly for weeks. By the third week of April 1945, Adolf Hitler had accepted something internally that he still refused to declare publicly. There would be no military solution. The war, as a contest of armies, was over. What remained was control over narrative, over loyalty, over the final image of power. Inside the bunker, discussions turned away from fronts and toward people. Who would stay? Who would leave? Who could still be trusted? Hitler's circle shrank rapidly. Some officers were dismissed. Others were sent on meaningless assignments that conveniently removed them from Berlin. A few, bound by loyalty or fear, remained close. This was not strategy. This was selection. On April 22, during what would become one of his final military conferences, the illusion finally cracked in public. When informed that a planned counterattack did not exist, that the units assigned to it had been destroyed, Hitler erupted. The anger was sudden, uncontrolled, and raw. He accused the army of betrayal. He accused his generals of cowardice. He accused everyone but himself. Then, just as suddenly, the rage collapsed into exhaustion. Witnesses described a man deflated, staring at the table, his voice barely audible. For the first time, he admitted openly that the war was lost. The statement was brief, almost whispered, but it changed everything. After that meeting, Hitler withdrew almost completely from military planning. Conferences became shorter, decisions were delegated. Maps remained on the walls, but no one believed in them anymore. The bunker entered its final phase. Eva Braun was now almost constantly at Hitler's side. Their relationship, hidden for years, moved to the center of daily life underground. She spoke of the future less and focused instead on comfort. Small gestures, familiar routines, moments of calm inside a collapsing world. Those close to her noticed something unsettling. She was not afraid. Whether through denial or resolve, she appeared to have accepted the outcome long before others. In contrast, Hitler oscillated between clarity and delusion, moments of sharp awareness followed by retreats into ideology and grievance. Plans for the regime's end accelerated. Documents were prepared, orders were rewritten, instructions were given regarding what should happen to files, to symbols, to bodies. The concern was no longer victory, but control over what would be found afterward, what history would see. Above ground, the city was disintegrating. Soviet forces pressed inward street by street. Resistance became fragmented, desperate, often meaningless. Units fought until ammunition ran out, then surrendered or disappeared. Reports arriving in the bunker described chaos, not fronts. Hitler listened without comment. At times, he appeared almost detached from the suffering beyond the walls. At other moments, he framed it as destiny, the final test of loyalty for a nation he believed had failed him. The idea that Germany deserved destruction if it could not meet his expectations hardened into conviction. During these days, Hitler dictated political statements outlining his interpretation of events. He assigned blame, he justified decisions, he shaped the story he wanted the world to inherit. This was not confession, it was explanation, and it mattered deeply to him. Meanwhile, the physical reality of the bunker worsened. Supplies dwindled, sanitation failed, air became stale. Even the underground shelter could not fully escape the war pressing down from above. The sounds of combat grew constant, not distant anymore, immediate. Everyone knew what that meant. Still, Hitler resisted one final step. He refused to discuss his own end openly. Not yet. Those around him sensed the hesitation. Some believed he was waiting for a final sign, a collapse of enemy unity, a sudden political shift, anything that would allow him to delay the inevitable by even a few days.
But no sign came. Instead, Soviet troops closed within a few hundred meters of the bunker. Shells struck nearby buildings, dust filled corridors, the walls trembled with every impact. The end was no longer theoretical. It was approaching physically. On April 28th, news arrived that shattered what remained of Hitler's trust. Confirmation that Heinrich Himmler had attempted to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies. The betrayal was complete. Hitler's reaction was not just anger, it was final clarity. From that moment on, there would be no compromise, no negotiation, no escape. Loyalty would be defined only by who stayed until the last moment. Decisions that had been postponed now became unavoidable. But they were not yet carried out. Not yet. Because before the end could come, Hitler needed to settle unfinished matters, political, personal, and symbolic. And those choices would shape what followed in the bunker's final days.
Berlin's final hours were no longer about strategy. They were about survival. Survival of ideals, of memory, of perception. Inside the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler moved slowly through the cramped corridors. Maps still hung on walls, marked with pins and notes, but they no longer represented reality. They represented hope, hope that had long since vanished. By April 29th, Hitler had made a series of irreversible decisions. He married Eva Braun in a small private ceremony, a gesture of normalcy in a world collapsing around him. The witnesses were few, but their presence mattered little. This was a personal act, not a political one. Immediately after, Hitler dictated his political testament. The words were meticulous, precise, and ideological. Blame was assigned to traitors, to generals, to anyone who had not fulfilled their duty. Loyalty was praised only for those who had remained until the end. It was both confession and manipulation. He shaped the story that would survive him. Meanwhile, preparations for his death were underway. Cyanide capsules were distributed to trusted aides. Instructions were given for what would happen to his and Eva Braun's bodies. Every detail, from the method to the disposal, was planned with deliberate precision. The goal was control. Even in death, Hitler sought to dictate perception. Outside, Berlin was collapsing. Soviet artillery had reached the city center. Fires raged in streets. Civilians fled underground or hid in ruins, while soldiers fought in isolated pockets. The war had reached its conclusion not in grand battles, but in chaos, smoke, and rubble. Inside the bunker, tension was almost palpable. Every step was measured, every action deliberate. There were no illusions left. The end had arrived. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun followed through with their plans. Hitler took cyanide and fired his pistol. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were discovered moments later by aides. They were carried up to the garden, doused in fuel, and set alight. A final attempt to control even the memory of death. Witnesses later described the scene as surreal. A man who had dominated the world reduced to smoke, ashes, and silence in a few minutes. The Reich was gone, its leader gone. Only the echoes remained. In the hours that followed, chaos intensified. Generals debated their next steps. Soldiers surrendered in pockets. Civilians emerged cautiously from hiding. Berlin, once the heart of the Nazi Empire, had become a city of ruins, mourning, and fear. The world would later learn of Hitler's death through fragmented reports. Rumors circulated. Propaganda delayed confirmation. But by May 1st, the truth was undeniable. Germany had lost not just a leader, but the very command that had held the nation together. Yet inside the minds of those who survived, questions remained. How had it come to this? What mistakes were irreversible? Who was truly responsible? The answers would occupy historians, scholars, and survivors for decades. For the witnesses inside the bunker, the answers were immediate. The war was over. The Führer was dead. Berlin had fallen. As the dust settled over the ruins of the city, a new world began to emerge. The Allies took control. Survivors pieced together what remained, and the story of Adolf Hitler, his rise, his decisions, his last hours, became part of history. For those following the endgame of the Third Reich, these final days serve as a stark reminder. Power can be absolute, but only temporarily. Leadership can inspire loyalty, fear, or obedience, but it cannot reverse reality. And history will always judge those who try to rewrite it, even in the smoke of their own making. If you found this journey into history gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world, one story at a time.